let's say I want to fetch some data from a stock market API using only JavaScript. The problem is that we can't because JavaScript itself doesn't know how to speak to the internet. The features that allow us to speak to the internet sit in the browser. Instead, we write JavaScript code that acts as a front for a bunch of features that are not part of JavaScript. For example, the Fetch API is a feature that lives in the browser, and I will be using the Fetch API to explain what promises are. So here, suppose I have a promises.js file, and in here I've defined a function that just prints whatever that you give it. So here I'm using the Fetch API to fetch some data, and after executing this fetch function, whatever it returns, we store it in response. And finally, after we get some data, I just want to print the stock price. So as I previously mentioned, Fetch is not part of JavaScript. It is part of the web browser APIs. We use labels from within JavaScript to start up web browser features. The web browser feature started by the Fetch label is XHR, or otherwise known as XML HTTP request. Alright, so let's walk through this file line by line and see exactly what's happening. So first we're declaring a function called print stock price. And essentially we can think of this as a variable, print stock price, and in that variable we are storing the entire function definition so we can reference it later at some point. And then here I am creating a const response, and here I am assigning the return value that is given to us after we execute the fetch function. But we currently don't know what that is, and in a moment we'll see exactly what that is. So when we use promises and fetch is a promise, two things happen. One, we start a background web browser feature, and two, we produce a special object known as a promise object. And this is what gets returned into JavaScript. So this promise object is what will get stored in response. So again, when we execute the fetch function, two things happen. So we start the web browser feature known as XHR. So in other words, go fetch some data. And two, we return this promise object back into JavaScript. And this promise object is what will get stored in response. And so the promise object will contain a property on it called value, which will be undefined initially. Once we get back some data from our API, the property value will be updated with the data returned from the API call. And so let's go ahead and update our response variable to hold this promise object with the property value and set it to undefined. Okay, so at this point we have executed the fetch function and have observed what happens. So do we wait here at this line of code and block the thread? So in other words, don't read or run any more code until we get back some data. No, we can continue on with our code, whether or not we have received data. And I really won't talk too much about asynchronicity in this video. It'll just complicate things. And the point of this video is just to try to explain what promises are and keep the video focused and contained. But hopefully, after you learn this piece of the puzzle, when you go learn about asynchronous behavior on your own, it will be a little bit more intuitive. Okay, finally, we're able to move on to the last line of code. And so here we are referencing the response object, and then we are executing a method on it called then, and to it we're passing a reference to print stock price. This brings us to another property on the promise object, and that property is known as onFulfillment. onFulfillment will initially be an empty array. And I've gone ahead and updated the promise object to show the onFulfillment property, which contains an empty array. So the .then method's only job is to take function definitions and stick them onto the onFulfillment array. And let's go ahead and update the onFulfillment array. And to it, let's give it the print stock price function. And so the function definition or definitions in the onFulfillment array will be auto-triggered when our value property is updated. Value will be passed into my function as the input when value is updated. Okay, now that we have walked through all the code in the file, let's just say our API finally gave us back some data. And the data we get back is just the stock price for Tesla. And that stock price happens to be $242.82. Now that we have data, we are ready to update the value property on the promise object. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll update value to contain the data that we got back from our API. And updating the value property will auto-trigger the functions in the onFulfillment array. And so we'll go ahead and look up the function definition to print stock price, which is stored somewhere in memory. And value will be passed into print stock price. And after running the code in this function, this will just print $242.82. But what if we don't get data back and instead get an error message? And so this brings us to the onRejection property on the promise object. Initially, it's an empty array. So I've gone ahead and updated the promise object to contain the onRejection property. And to it, I've assigned the empty array. And so the catch method's only job is to take function definitions and stick them onto the onRejection array. So let's go ahead and update the onRejection array to contain the console.log function. And so the function definition or definitions in the onRejection array will be auto-triggered when we get an error. So let's just say when we're making this API call, we get an error. And when we get an error, we will just, console log whatever the error message is. But wait, there's more. There's another property on the promise object, which is known as status. And when we first create a promise, status defaults to pending. If we get back some data, status is updated to resolved. If we get back an error, status is updated to rejected. And so I've updated the promise object with the status property, and its value can be one of three things. It is either pending, it is resolved, or it is rejected. And technically, status is what auto-triggers either the onFulfillment array or the onRejection array. And one more thing, what gets stored in value is actually an object. I used a single number to keep things very simple. And so here I am showing a much more complete example. We can either pass the entire function definition to the .then method, or we can define the function outside, like we are here, and then give it a reference to that function. So either doing it this way or this way makes no difference. They are functionally equivalent. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, value is actually an object. And so before we can work with the data that we get back from the API, we need to turn it into valid JavaScript object notation. And that's what we are doing here with the first then method. And so this response parameter here, we can name it whatever we want. But typically, people call it response. And here I'm just calling the JSON method to transform the data that we get back from the API into something that we can work with. And then in the next .then method, I'm calling the print stock price. So here within the function definition, I'm just working with it as I am used to working with JavaScript objects. And I'm printing the price. And so here is the same example, but it's much more concise. And typically this is how people write their code when they're using the fetch API. They use arrow functions. And again, before we can work with the data that is returned from the API, we need to turn it into a valid JavaScript object. Only after we have formatted our data can we work with it. And here I'm doing the same thing. I'm just printing the price of the Tesla stock. So this example and this example, they're doing exactly the same thing. And also don't forget to put a catch method. Always do this, because if you get an error, you want to make sure that you're aware of that error. If not, if you don't do this, you end up with an error message that reads, I believe it's something like unhandled promise rejection. So always make sure to put a catch statement and just at the very least log that error message to the console. And with that, now you know what JavaScript promises are.